All right, next I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Elaine Mills. She's a member of the 2012 Master Gardener training class, and her primary interest is in sustainable gardening. She created the first set of fact sheets on tried and true native plants that are now a popular resource on our website, and she'll be telling us more about that today. She spent 8 years photographing native plants in the public and private gardens and enjoys selecting pictures for her photo library to illustrate her talks, articles, and weekly educational posts on our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. In addition, she serves as one of the coordinators for our Glen Carlin demonstration garden in Arlington. So welcome, Elaine, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And I'd also like to extend a big thank you to Colleen, Julie, Nicole, and any other Master Gardeners who are helping behind the scenes. This spring, when the Public Education Committee was meeting and we were trying to decide what courses we might be offering later in the season in the Sustainable Landscaping series, it occurred to me that the category of plants, native plants, that we hadn't yet focused on was native vines. So I offered to put together a presentation, and that's what I will be sharing with you today. To give you an overview, we'll be talking initially about characteristics of vines and their growth habits. I'd like to call to your attention some information on invasive vines and then explain the benefits of using native vines instead. I'll talk also briefly about landscape uses of vines, and then the major portion of the presentation will go into much more detail on a dozen vines that are native to the Mid-Atlantic. And at the end, I'll be presenting some resources. As Leslie mentioned, we'll be stopping at several points throughout the presentation to field your questions. So looking first at characteristics of vines. Vines are described as perennial plants that use neighboring plants, rocks, trees, or other structures for physical support. They may be herbaceous, that is, their roots persist, but the tops will die back each year. Some of them are woody, that their stems persist, and they may actually offer winter interest. Most of these vines actually prefer to grow in sunny conditions and moist soil, but they do grow in a range of light and soil conditions, and I will be pointing those out. And all of them use specialized stems to anchor or wrap themselves around those supporting structures. Looking more closely at some growth habits of vines, there are self-climbing vines. These climb using adherent rootlets or adhesive pads, and here's a detail of that. Some examples are native Virginia creeper, climbing hydrangea, and the non-native English ivy and winter creeper. A second type of vines are the twining vines. These wind around supports with the touch-sensitive main shoots. This allows them to grow upwards, and they wind either clockwise or counterclockwise. Some examples of these vines are native Dutchman's pipe, trumpet honeysuckle and American wisteria, and non-native Japanese honeysuckle and the two species of Asian wisterias. Now, most plants apparently grow in a counterclockwise direction, and that's shown here with our example of the American wisteria. The vines appear to grow from left to right. Then the clockwise vines grow from right to left. And this example is the native trumpet honeysuckle. Now, the reason for the direction of growth is not known, but research has shown that it has nothing to do with the position of the sun, nor does it have to do with geographical location. For example, the hemisphere in which the plant grows. Another type of habit is stem tendril vines, and these use touch-sensitive extensions of that main stem, and they will wind around the objects to stabilize them as they pursue their upward growth. And some examples of these are grapevines and passion flowers. And finally, there are the leaf tendril vines. These wind their leaf stems or petioles around objects to help stabilize their upward growth. And examples of those are native virginsbower and other species of clematis. Now, I mentioned that I would like to call your attention to vines that have been designated as invasive here in Northern Virginia, in Arlington County and Alexandria, Virginia, but many of them are invasive well beyond this region. According to a presidential executive order from 1999, invasive species, both animal and plant species, are defined as non-native or alien species that are introduced into an ecosystem where they wouldn't naturally occur. And they're invasive because they cause harm either to the environment, the economy, or human health. The vines I'll be talking about are primarily causing harm to the environment, but in a sense, they do have an impact on the economy because of the cost in their removal. But all of these vines have in common the fact that they seed or fruit profusely. They grow rampantly. They can even overgrow shrubs and trees. But what is most concerning is that they spread beyond our home gardens, beyond cultivation, either from wind-borne seeds or the seeds of fruit that is gathered by birds and then expelled in other areas. These vines spread to our roadsides, to our fields, and very concerning to our forests. There they will spread in the understory, smothering those ground level plants and even grow up into the canopy. And they are disturbing the balance of our native plants and the health of those plants by outcompeting them. So the particular vines, 8 of them that have been designated as invasive in our area are the following. Asian wisteria, both the Japanese and Chinese wisteria, which is admired so much for its fragrance. English ivy, which is quite often the go-to plant for ground cover in our area. 5-leaved akebia, enjoyed for its beautiful flowers. Japanese honeysuckle that we all enjoy for its fragrance. Oriental bittersweet and porcelainberry that are admired for the berries. Sweet autumn clematis for its abundant flowers and sweet fragrance, and winter creeper, an evergreen ground cover. I would propose instead that you might want to consider using some of the native vines I'll be discussing this morning. These are suited to our local soil and climate, so they're likely to be successful in growing here. As you'll see, as we continue, they have many desirable ornamental qualities. And very importantly, they have evolved with our local fauna. So they can provide nectar and pollen for our pollinators. They can serve as host plants for Lepidoptera. That means that their foliage will provide nourishment for the larval stage or caterpillars of butterflies, moths, skippers, and fritillaries. This allows them to succeed for their full life cycle. Native vines can also provide fruit for wildlife and offer cover for a variety of animals. There are many landscape uses of vines. They can be allowed to sprawl as a ground cover. They can provide privacy screening or shade. And in small gardens, they not only provide vertical interest, but can help you make space of the limited perimeter that you have. They can be grown on fences, on trellises, posts, arbors, and walls. And I'd like to point out here this picture of a trellis. This was taken at the home of a friend and Master Gardener colleague, Alyssa Ford Morell. She designed this trellis and had it constructed. It's quite large. As you can see, it reaches up 2 stories on the facade of her home. And it's very cleverly designed. It is hinged down here at the bottom, and it has a catch that releases here. And in times when they need to do maintenance or painting on the facade of the home, this can be released, and then the trellis will level down, and they can take care of that while the vine is still growing successfully on the trellis. Now, I'm hoping that all of you got to see the handout, the one-page handout that I sent. The link should have been sent in the same email message where you got the Zoom to this, the link to this Zoom session. And on that handout, you'll see some links to helpful fact sheets. These are found on the website of Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia at mgnv.org. And they can be found by going to the website under the plants menu. The first set of fact sheets are on invasive plants. And this is what they look like. This is an example of one of the invasive vines, the Japanese honeysuckle. If you follow the links directly from the handout, you won't have to go through the menu on the website. The second category of fact sheets are the tried and true fact sheets of native plants that Leslie made mention of. And that's what these look like. There are well over 100 of those. And if you end up going to the invasive plant fact sheets, for example, let's say you wanted to see Japanese honeysuckle and learn about some of the details of the problems that it causes, you can follow a link to learn about examples of preferred native vines that you could substitute for this particular invasive vine. So the example here is Carolina jessamine. There are two other resources that I have links for on your handout. The first is to a website page on invasive plants and better alternatives. And that page has links to the complete lists of of plants that are considered invasive in Arlington and Alexandria. And additionally, there's a link to this earlier presentation that I gave. This covers a wide variety of invasive plants and native alternatives, but there is a section on invasive vines and preferred native vines. And at the end of that talk, I go into quite a bit of detail about how to remove invasive vines, especially English ivy. Do we have any questions at this point?
What is the best way to remove English ivy on or around my rhododendrons without harming the shrub?
Okay, let me go ahead and answer that one now. I go into, as I say, quite a bit of detail in that one particular presentation. One way that I learned for removing English ivy is by using a shovel with a jagged edge. And you can come in at a 45-degree angle that will allow you to really get safely to the roots of the ivy without disturbing other plants. If you work as a team, you can have one person use the shovel in that manner and the other person to actually roll up the ivy. In other words, you won't be breaking off individual pieces of it. You will be taking it as a whole and just wrapping it up like a carpet. The problem if you have pieces that break off is that those will reroot and continue spreading. If the vines are growing up onto trees, which is what we refer to as a choking hazard, the roots, those aerial roots, will be sometimes quite substantial on the bark of the trees or shrubs. And you don't want to be tearing that because that will damage the bark of the desirable plants. But what you can do is use a knife to try to cut that the root of the stem of that ivy vine at the base. And that will allow any of the foliage that has grown up higher to die back. Another thing that you can do if you find that repeated cutting back of the ivy and trying to roll it up isn't quite taking care of it, in a very selective manner, you can use an herbicide. And one safe way to do that is to actually use a piece of PVC pipe to put that around the exposed end of that cut stem, and to either gently spray or actually paint the end of that exposed stem of the ivy with the herbicide, and that will get to it directly without disturbing the surrounding plants. I also go into a lot of detail in that presentation, presentation on invasive vines, about how you can work systematically if you have a whole hillside covered with ivy.
If it, like I had the same problem, she was mentioning her rhododendron and I had it in my azalea. Would you suggest cutting it off at the base and then like either letting it dry out before you're pulling it out of your shrubs, or would you?
Yeah, that could be a good idea. You could see then that you've actually maybe gotten to the root somewhat, and you're beginning to kill it back. Then you can gently be pulling it away around away from around the roots of your desirable plants, and then you can maybe come in, if it's covering a wide area, come in with that tool to get even more deeply to the roots and pull them up, but you'll be safely away from the roots of your desirable shrub.
Okay. All right. And I'll let Colleen take back over for our next round of questions, but do you have another one, Colleen?
There was one, someone asked if they plant American groundnut next to an arsenic or pressure treated fence and the vine climbs the fence, will the tubers still be safe to eat?
That's a good question, and it's one that I'd like to research before answering. Whenever I give a presentation, I always go back through the chat and look more closely at questions, either questions I haven't been able to answer completely, or maybe I didn't have all the technical knowledge. And so I will respond to that question, and then I will be sending out an addendum document to everyone who's participating today, and then that document will also be posted along with the recording of this presentation when we upload it to the MGNV website.
Okay, thanks. That's good for now, Elaine.
Okay, very good. So now we'll actually move on to look at our 12 native vines. The first is Carolina jessamine, Gelsemium sempervirens. And I mentioned that these vines are generally native to the mid-Atlantic. This one actually grows in the southern coastal region of Virginia, but then it's native much further south. So it's native really to the southeast, although it does grow successfully here. It's actually the state flower of South Carolina. This is a climbing, twining, evergreen vine, grows about 10 to 20 feet long and 3 to 16 feet wide. It can grow in sun or part shade and prefers moist, humus-rich soil. Tolerates clay soil, drought, and wind, and is fairly deer resistant. Just note that all parts of this plant are toxic if eaten. So for example, you wouldn't want children to try to be sucking the sweet nectar of this flower. It attracts bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds, and its dense foliage provides cover for birds. There are conflicting reports about the possible toxicity of the nectar to honeybees. Some growers seem to indicate that their bees don't have a problem, and others said that if they collected too much of the nectar, that was problematic. So this maybe needs more research if you happen to have honeybees in your garden. Carolina jessamine has glossy pointed leaves on wiry reddish stems, and these take on a purple patina in the wintertime. It has long-lasting fragrant flowers. These will actually start blooming as early as December and last for a month or so into the very early spring. And then you'll see these thin, flattened fruit capsules. As far as planting and care tips, this plant does its best flowering in the sun, and you'll want to site it near entries and patios so you can enjoy its fragrance. You would want to prune it after flowering, and you might consider wearing gloves, as the sap may cause some skin irritation to those who are sensitive. You can use this as a climber on arbors, fences, and walls, as shown here, or as a ground cover on slopes and banks. It's an excellent replacement with its lovely flowers, sweet smelling flowers, for Japanese honeysuckle, invasive Japanese honeysuckle. Speaking of honeysuckle, here is our native trumpet or coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. This was chosen as the Virginia Native Plant Society's Wildflower of the Year in 2014. And in addition to the link to our own MGNV fact sheet, I give a link to a discussion on the Virginia Native Plant Society website for this plant. This is a vigorous twining semi-evergreen vine, and it has interesting papery exfoliating bark that's very attractive in the winter. This grows 8 to 20 feet in length and 6 to 12 feet wide in sun to part shade and moist soil conditions. It tolerates clay soil and black walnut. Be alert that deer may browse the leaves and stems. This plant attracts hummingbirds, as you can see from those brilliant colored flowers, butterflies and bees. Birds, many songbirds consume the berries, including purple finches, goldfinches, hermit thrushes, and American robins. And this is a larval host for over 30 Lepidoptera, including the spring azure butterfly and the hummingbird and snowberry clearwing moths. Trumpet honeysuckle has pairs of ovate leaves. They have rolled edges, and you'll see them fused below the flowers. Those trumpet-shaped flowers appear in whorled clusters, and they bloom from April to June and even intermittently into frost. In my garden, I've had them bloom as late as December. Then berries will appear from August to March, enjoyed by the birds I mentioned, and they will be set against the semi-evergreen foliage. Trumpet honeysuckle is very easy to propagate by layering, and it transplants well. Layering can occur in two ways. Naturally, one of the extending branches may touch the ground, and if it's held there, it may actually develop roots, and then you could cut it off and consider it a separate plant that you can either transplant elsewhere or pot up and share with friends. Or you can purposefully decide to do some layering yourself. Lay one of those long extending branches down onto the ground, weight it or fasten it in some fashion, allow it to grow for a period of time and check it periodically. And then you'll eventually see that roots have developed. Now, this is one of the vines that could fall prey to powdery mildew. So you'll want to provide good air circulation with careful pruning. Trumpet honeysuckle flowers on both old and new growth. It does produce more prolific flowers in the sun, and you can shape it after flowering. There is a John Clayton yellow flowered cultivar that is much more compact, 6 to 12 feet by 3 to 5 feet, and it's noted for its abundant fruit. And any of the trumpet honeysuckles are excellent vines for trellises, arbors, and fences, or you can use them as a sprawling ground cover. With its lovely fruit, it's a great replacement for invasive porcelainberry. Our next vine is American wisteria, Wisteria frutescens, and this is actually the Virginia Native Plant Society's Wildflower of the Year for 2021. And there's a link to that on your handout. This is a climbing, twining, woody, and deciduous vine reaching 15 to 30 feet in length and 4 to 8 feet spread. It can grow in either sun or part shade, and it prefers moist to wet soil, although it can tolerate drought and seasonal flooding. Deer will rarely damage this. Just be aware that the seeds are poisonous. The flowers attract butterflies and hummingbirds to the nectar. American wisteria has what are referred to as pinnately compound leaves. This is what they look like. This is one entire leaf. It all grows from the petiole, the leaf stem here. And so there are pairs of leaflets, odd numbers of them because they end with a terminal leaflet here. So 9 to 15 on this particular species. Wisteria has these dangling racemes of flowers from April to August. Racemes are spikes of flowers, and they all have separate flowers with little stalks of equal lengths. Then long bean-like pods will develop in the fall. Again, wisteria does its best flowering in the sun, and it will bloom on new wood when the vine is only a few feet long. It dislikes being transplanted, however, so you'll want to site it carefully. There are very specific guidelines for when and how to prune it, and I've provided a link to a reference on your handout. I would encourage you to remove the seed pods to encourage reblooming, and you would also want to do that to prevent the spread of the seed pods once they pop open, because these seeds are highly poisonous to cats and dogs. You can use American wisteria as a climber on fences, posts, trellises, arbors, and walls. And it's an excellent replacement for invasive Asian wisteria, both the japonica and the sinensis species. These develop very large woody stems and grow well up into the canopy of trees, smothering them, weighting them down, and allowing branches of the desirable trees to break. Our next native vine is Dutchman's pipe, Aristolochia macrophylla. This is a twining, woody, deciduous vine, 15 to 30 feet in length. It likes sun to part shade and moist, rich soil. It tolerates black walnut and pollution, but is intolerant of dry soil and is moderately deer resistant. This particular vine attracts butterflies and hummingbirds and is the larval host of the caterpillar for the pipe vine swallowtail butterfly. Dutchman's pipe has large heart-shaped leaves, and they grow very densely in an overlapping pattern. It has these interesting pipe-like flowers with an unusual, not particularly enjoyable fragrance. It's very appealing to the flies that pollinate it. And then those will appear in May to June, and then it will develop these cucumber-like seed capsules. As far as planting and care, Dutchman's pipe is one of the vines that does grow well from seed, and it grows quite vigorously. The only concern would be protection from wind. You can cut it back late in the winter to control its growth. Note that it can help create some deep shade, but you'll want to keep it away from your home because it's highly flammable and all parts of it are toxic. So you would use it for verandas, arbors, and garden walls away from your home or your porch or your deck. Our next vine is cross vine, Bignonia capreolata. This is a climbing, woody, semi-evergreen vine, quite a long one, 30 to 45 feet in length. It grows in sun to part shade and a wide range of soil conditions. So it tolerates shade, drought, and even brief flooding. And deer will seldom severely damage it. The lovely flowers attract butterflies and hummingbirds. Crossvine has pairs of glossy leaves that will take on a reddish purple color in the fall, and these very long tendrils. The buds appear in April and then open into tubular fragrant flowers that are in clusters from May to June. Another vine that flowers best in the sun, and you'll want to prune it after blooming if you want to control the spread. It will climb any structure it encounters, and you can cut the root suckers that will develop to control any aggressive growth. This is used very effectively as a climber on arbors and fences to provide privacy. This particular example is shown on our chain link fence in the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. Our next vine is American bittersweet, Celastris scandens. This is a twining, woody, deciduous vine, 10 to 20 feet in length. And I want to note that this is a dioecious plant. That means that there are separate male and female vines. This grows best in full sun and moist soil. It will tolerate drought and is deer resistant. It attracts birds to its colorful fruit. American bittersweet has ovate leaves that will turn a greenish yellow in the fall. And these small white flowers appear from May to June. And then these showy capsules in drooping clusters. This plant needs full sun for its best flowering and certainly for that colorful fruit display. And as I mentioned, it's dioecious, so it will require a male plant for fruiting, although some cultivars are self-fruitful. The vines can sucker and self-seed. If they're planted in lean soil, that will somewhat restrain the plant's growth. You'll want to prune it in late winter, removing any dead wood or excess growth from the mature vines, but prevent it from growing up into trees. This can provide a quick cover for different garden structures, and it can help camouflage stumps and rock piles. This, with its colorful fruit, is an excellent replacement for the invasive oriental bittersweet, which can really snarl up in trees. We'll take a pause here for any additional questions. Colleen?
Okay, Elaine, thank you. I know you mentioned pruning wisteria, but someone asked, should they deadhead their trumpet vine? And if so, where to make the cuts?
I think we generally leave the vine to grow, but if you did want to deadhead it, you would I think you would just pinch back where at the end of the blossom's stem. And then if you wanted to do any more severe pruning to control the spread, then you would do that further along on the branches, and make sure that you're cutting any suckers that are coming up from the roots as well.
Okay, great. There was a question about whether any of these vines can be grown in containers.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I gave a presentation last year called Small Space Gardening for Pollinators, and there's one whole portion of that presentation where I highly recommend it, especially for those who have perhaps limited space, to use a container. What you might want to do would be to have a sizable container at the base of some kind of structure, either a trellis or a post, let's say a post of your deck if you wanted to use that, or a post of a veranda or a pergola. And that way you could just be able to control the root spread, and then you could easily prune and control the growth as it goes upward on that other structure.
Okay, great. Someone asked, what's the definition of semi-evergreen when referring to vines?
Semi-evergreen are vines that generally in their more southern region would remain evergreen. And here maybe, I'm speaking here, of course, from Northern Virginia. In a very cold winter, they might die back to some extent. So for example, I've mentioned that the native honeysuckle, the trumpet or coral honeysuckle, is semi-evergreen. In milder winters, I've had the foliage remain pretty much intact. In a winter where there was, say, ice landing on it and freezing, some of the leaves might die back, and it might look a little battered, a little the worse for wear, although it won't completely lose its leaves.
Okay. There was a question about the John Clayton cultivar of coral honeysuckle and whether it is just as attractive to butterflies.
Yeah, yes, it does appear to be attractive to them.
Okay. Another questioner wanted to know, do any of these vines work well if planted together?
Well, one thing I have to say about vines, native vines as a category, is that I find they grow more rambunctiously, more abundantly. Some people might even term some of them aggressive than other categories of native plants. And so it might be a bit of a challenge to combine them. We tried to do this in a pollinator bed at the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. We had a large structure that was put at the back of a pollinator bed. It was maybe 8 or 10 feet wide and about 6 feet high. And we decided that we would grow the trumpet honeysuckle on one side, and the very last plant that I will be discussing, the virginsbower, the native clematis, on the other side. And at the moment, the clematis seems to be overwhelming the trumpet honeysuckle. So especially because they may have different ways that they attach to structures. As you saw at the beginning, I've described the different manners of attachment. And because they could grow very abundantly, their vines could intertwine, that the branches could intertwine and make it something of a challenge to keep them discreet. If, on the other hand, you had quite a long fence line, you might plant one vine at one end and a second vine at another end, and then have them grow toward each other. And that could be done successfully, I think, and have them both look attractive rather than just blending and not really being attractively discreet.
Okay, that kind of segues into another question. Someone had asking, what's the best vine to cover a long chain link fence along a sidewalk in full sun? They're wondering about crossvine as a choice.
Crossvine is an excellent choice. That is the vine that we have growing along one entire length, in fact, 2 long lengths of chain link fence, dividing our garden from a private neighboring property on one side of the Glen Carlin demonstration garden. And so it grows very abundantly, and it provides an attractive screen. So it gives them some privacy when we're having our garden work parties or other visitors are coming to the garden. So excellent choice.
And Elaine, when would be the best time to plant that?
I think the heat of the summer might be a little challenging, but I would think either the spring or the fall, as long as it gets a good establishment in the fall. Once the weather turns a little bit cool, I think it could get a good head start for growth for next year.
Okay, great. Someone else asked how to differentiate between invasive and native bittersweet.
Let's see if we can go back to those. Those fruits look a little bit different. This is what the native ones look like. They have this orange covering and a very dark red center. And then the invasive variety has yellow outsides and then this orange colored center. I'll try to look further into this and provide more details to help distinguish between them when I provide answers to the chat questions.
There were also questions about differentiating the good and the bad clematis, but I know you're going to get to that later.
Yes.
Someone else asked, what's the smallest or least aggressive vine to grow?
I personally enjoy growing the trumpet honeysuckle. The photos that I showed were that vine growing in my own garden. And if I don't pay enough attention to it, I've had it grow up. In that one picture, I had it growing on a little arbor next to a garage. And at one point I had the tendrils actually going up into the gutters of the garage, and I just needed to pry them off there and trim them back. But I found that one can be maintained pretty easily. If you look at the fact sheets for the vines, or then maybe go back and look when this recording is posted, look at the lengths of the vines. If you look for the ones that grow to the shortest height, those are going to be the least aggressive vines. Okay.
Sort of a perpetual question. This person has neighbors that have invasive vines. Is there any hope they can be kept out of your yard?
Oh, oh, that's
no problem with those neighbors.
That's quite quite a challenge.
Yeah,
I guess the most you can do would be to try to control any of the suckering roots that are coming up. Of course, if they're spreading by either seeds or fruit, seedlings could easily be coming up in your yard. And if the vines are well established and the neighbors love those vines, I don't know that there's too much you can do except maybe try to talk to them and ask them to somehow control them, or maybe they might be open to considering a native alternative.
good. Someone asked, do you have any experience with the lemonade variety of honeysuckle? And does it follow the same points you've made about regular honeysuckle?
I'm not familiar with lemonade. I'm assuming that's a cultivar
Yeah, I
name.
assume so, yes.
Okay, I will look further into that. There are different gardens. For example, Mount Cuba up in Pennsylvania does a lot of trials of plants, and they will provide reports on various categories of plants as to which ones will continue to provide beneficial features for pollinators and other wildlife.
Okay,
But I will look further into that.
thanks, Elaine. Someone planted crossvine over a decade ago and it's grown well. It's taken over as a ground cover, but it is not flowering.
Hmm.
Any
Uh, as I mentioned, that's one that really does best when flowering in full sun. I guess perhaps the questioner could enter into the chat what the sun conditions are. Now, interestingly, some vines will actually flower best when they're growing vertically. So the one excellent example of that is our invasive English ivy. That vine may just stay with its prominent foliage when it's spreading as a ground cover. If it's allowed to grow up even onto a short chain link fence, much less up into the canopies of trees, that's when it begins flowering. And pollinators will be attracted to those flowers, fruit will form, and then birds will carry that fruit to other areas. So I don't know if that may be the issue that's here, that for some reason that particular vine won't flower unless it takes a vertical form. But I will try to look further into that.
Okay, we're good on questions now. Thanks, Elaine.
Okay, we're halfway through our discussion of our native vines, and we'll continue on with the remaining 6. The next one, common moon vine, Menispermum canadense, is one that Alyssa, my friend Alyssa, called to my attention. She discovered it growing in the home of one of her colleagues. She does gardening for that person. It's a twining deciduous woody vine that grows 8 to 20 feet in length and 3 to 6 feet wide. This is another one that's dioecious, that has the separate male and female vines. This one is more of an understory plant. Unlike the others, it prefers part shade and moist soil. It's deer resistant, and note that all parts of this plant are highly toxic to humans and mammals. However, woodland birds can eat the fruit. It's a larval host to the moonseed moth that feeds on its foliage. And it also provides cover and nesting habitat for birds. Moonvine has rounded to shallowly lobed leaves and these very subtle flowers on both the male and female vines from May to July. Then this fruit that looks rather like that of a wild grape fruit ripens in late summer. And note again that that is toxic to humans. This is what the seeds look like inside, somewhat like a crescent moon, and that's what gives it its name. As far as planting and care, this is a plant that actually does best in dappled shade, and you definitely want to avoid planting it in full sun in hot summer locations. It can spread both by rhizomes and seeds. And as I mentioned before, you'll need a male plant in order for the female plants to fruit. You'll want to be careful to distinguish this from the fruits of wild grape. The way you can tell a wild grape is that it has tendrils and multiple small ovoid seeds rather than that crescent-shaped seed inside. Moon vine can be grown on a support structure or used to control erosion on woodland slopes. Our next native vine is Virginia creeper, Parthenocissus quinquifolia. This is a vigorous, clinging, deciduous vine. This is the one with those little adhesive attachments. It grows quite long, 30 to 50 feet in length and 5 to 10 feet spread. It can grow in either sun to part shade and likes moist soil, although it tolerates a wide range of other conditions: clay soil, drought, erosion, heavy shade, and black walnut. Deer will rarely damage it, and note that the fruit is highly toxic and sap may cause skin irritation. This is an important winter food source for birds. Virginia creeper has compound palmate leaves. They look like the fingers of a hand spreading. And as I mentioned, it attaches by adhesive holdfasts at the tendril ends. It has very insignificant flowers that are basically hidden by the foliage, but you will spot those from May to August. And then in the fall, it has brilliant foliage. A reminder that the fall fruit is toxic to humans. Virginia creeper is very easy to grow, and it tolerates urban conditions and a wide range of soils. It, as I mentioned, needs no support. You'll want to site it where it'll have plenty of room to expand and grow, and wear gloves to protect your hands from the sap. It's a very effective ground cover for erosion control, and you can also use it as a climber for brick or stone walls. But an alert, it can damage with those adhesive surfaces. It can damage painted surfaces, gutters, shutters, or wiring around homes. It's an excellent replacement with its vigorous growth for invasive English ivy. And I've explained just a moment ago why ivy is so troublesome, both because of the flowering and then the spread of the fruit to our natural areas. But it, because of its dense foliage, it just absolutely smothers any of the leaves of a tree and prevents it from photosynthesizing, and then that native or the tree underneath will die. Our next native vine is passion flower, Passiflora incarnata. This is a very rapid growing tendril climbing vine. It's deciduous, grows about 25 feet long and 3 to 6 feet wide. It prefers sun and moist soil, although it will tolerate clay soil and drought, and it is moderately deer resistant. It attracts butterflies and bees to its flowers. It offers fruit that I'll be showing you shortly to its birds, and it's also a larval host for fritillary butterflies. Passion flower has very large, showy, fragrant flowers that bloom all from May all the way into September. It has these interesting 3-lobed leaves, and then it will form this egg-shaped fruit that's referred to as maypops in July. It began appearing in July, and then it will mature in the fall. Now, this plant has the common name maypops for several reasons. One is that it is rather late to put out new growth in the spring, and that growth appears suddenly in May. Also, the heavy fruit, when it drops, may fall with a popping sound. As far as planting and care, you may want to pinch it back in its first season of growth to encourage bushiness rather than length. And note that it is an aggressive spreader, so you'll want to remove suckers regularly to control its root spread. You can cover the roots lightly with mulch to protect them. And that fruit, the maypops fruit, can be eaten fresh or cooked in jelly. And I provide a link on your handout to tell you how to prepare that. You can grow it on arbors, trellises, and fences. And with its lovely flowers, it's an excellent replacement for invasive 5-leaved akebia. There is also a yellow passion flower, Passiflora lutea. This climbs by tendrils and is deciduous, somewhat shorter in length, 10 to 20 feet long. And this one, like the moon vine, also likes part shade and moist, fertile, well-drained soil. It will tolerate occasional dryness. It's deer resistant. This offers pollen for the specialized passion flower bee, fruit for birds, and it's also a larval host for several butterflies. Yellow passion flower has wide, shallowly lobed leaves rather than those deeply cut leaves of the purple passion flower, and those will turn a yellow color in the fall. These very complex, small saucer-shaped flowers bloom from May to September, and this is a look at the purple or black berries. These appear from August to October. This, I've read, is considered the hardiest of the passion flower vines. It's rapid growing, but it is better behaved than the Passiflora incarnata, the purple passion flower. You can grow it on a trellis or a fence in a butterfly garden, or allow it to sprawl along the ground. Another native vine is trumpet creeper, Campsis radicans. You may see this quite a bit along roadsides. It's a very vigorous, clinging, deciduous vine, grows 25 to 40 feet in length in either sun to part shade, and it likes moist soil conditions, although it can tolerate clay soil and drought, and deer will rarely damage it. With those colorful trumpet-shaped flowers, it's very attractive to hummingbirds. It has pinnate leaves, like those I pointed out earlier with the native wisteria, and they also have serrated leaflets on very substantial woody stems. It has clusters of long, showy, trumpet-shaped flowers. I think this is the bright color of the straight species. The orange flower that on the previous slide may have been a cultivar. And these bloom from June to September. And this is a look at the long bean-like seed pods that develop. Trumpet creeper is another plant that does best when flowering in sun, and it blooms on new wood, so it can be pruned in the early spring. This particular plant suckers profusely from underground runners, and it can also self-seed. So you'll want to plan very carefully for containment and any pruning regimen to control its growth. Also note that it's quite heavy as it grows and it will need substantial support. Here's an example of a pergola with very substantial posts. This is in the pocket garden behind the Nature Conservancy headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. This plant, because of its spread, will be a quick cover for walls and other substantial structures. And our last vine for today is Virgin's Bower, Clematis virginiana. It's a climbing, twining, semi-evergreen vine, grows somewhat shorter in length, 6 to 20 feet. This is another example of a dioecious plant, although some vines will actually have what are referred to as perfect flowers. That means that they will have both the male and female plant parts. It prefers part shade and moist soil, although it can tolerate some sun and dry shade, as well as black walnut. Deer will seldom severely damage it. And just be aware that the foliage is toxic to cats and dogs. Native clematis is a pollinator magnet. It attracts bees, wasps, and butterflies. It's the larval host for the clematis clearwing moth, and it provides good nesting habit for songbirds. It has trifoliate leaves that have toothed edges. And as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, it climbs by the leaf petioles, which act like tendrils. It has a very abundant, fragrant tubular flowers that appear in clusters, and they will be seen from July to September. And then you'll see these very attractive, showy thread-like seed heads on the female plants. Virgin's bower is one of a few vines that will actually flower in heavy shade. It can spread both through self-seeding and suckering, and you'll want to prune it after flowering anytime from late fall to early spring. You can actually prune it down to about a foot, and you'll want to retain the lowest 2 or 3 leaf buds, and wear gloves to prevent contact dermatitis. You can use this as a climber on arbors and fences, but avoid having it overwhelm any landscape shrubs. It's an excellent replacement for the sweet autumn clematis. And as Colleen mentioned, I'm going to show you here the distinct difference in the foliage. The foliage of the native Virgin's bower is trifoliate, the three-part leaves, and those definitely have serrated edges. The sweet autumn clematis, the Clematis ternifolia, the invasive species, has pairs of leaves. They're glossier and they have smooth edges. Now, I mentioned that clematis was the last of the native vines, but there's actually one more that I'm going to discuss. That is poison ivy, Rhus toxicodendron. Now, this is obviously inappropriate for gardens, but it does have a purpose in our woodland areas. Reptiles and amphibians use the plant as shelter. Many insects feed on the nectar of the flowers, and the berries are a good food source for birds. And as a reminder, here's how to make the distinction between poison ivy and the Virginia creeper, for which it is sometimes mistaken. So poison ivy has groups of 3 compound leaflets. The size and the shape of those leaves may vary. Virginia creeper, on the other hand, has 5 leaflets in that palmate hand-like arrangement. If you should be so unlucky as to have poison ivy, I have a few tips for dealing with it. The cause of the allergic reactions is a volatile oil, urushiol, and it's found in all parts of the plant. So when you're gardening near the vine, it's advisable to wear long-sleeved garments and gloves, and you'll want to wash your hands thoroughly with soap if you come in contact with it. You should also wash any contaminated items, including tools, socks, and shoes, so that oil doesn't spread. And you'll certainly want to keep your pets away from the plant to avoid the transfer of the oil. You can remove it either by pulling with gloved hands or repeated mowing. And if necessary, you can use an herbicide, as I described earlier, as a last resort, applying it just to the freshly cut stumps. And you certainly do not want to burn it. Breathing the smoke is toxic and very hazardous to your lungs. Now, I realized this morning, as I was doing a practice run at home, that there was one other native vine that I could well have described for you, and I didn't have time to add that at the last minute, but I will send additional information on that. And that is the honey vine milkweed. It's actually related to our other native milkweeds. It is a native plant. It's a twining perennial vine with opposite leaves that are very elongated and somewhat heart-shaped in length. They are paired at each node. It has white flowers, and then it will develop seed pods that look very reminiscent of all of our other milkweed plants. And when those burst open, very similar seeds will spread throughout your garden. So I will write up a description of that, include some photos, and send that information to all those who are participating here. Just a quick note, our presentation today has been made by the Arlington and Alexandria unit of Virginia Cooperative Extension. This is the organization that provides training for master gardeners. And we provide science-based information from our land grant universities. Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. And our particular unit has been doing this since 1985. And we do it in a number of ways, of course, through classes, and there will be additional classes running on Fridays via Zoom. And we're hoping next year to be able to begin resuming some of the class presentations in person. We also have a help desk, and I'm sure Julie will be putting the link mgarlex@gmail.com in the chat box, and you can post any questions you have there. We've also resumed plant clinics at some of our local farmers markets, and we also have some wonderful demonstration gardens where you can see examples of these plants for inspiration. Our unit of VCE is supported by a nonprofit group, Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, and we have a website. I've made mention of that several times. We also have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts that you may want to check out. As far as where to see some of the native vines I've been describing, first of all, you can go to this link on our MGNV website, and that will take you to a page that describes our our demonstration gardens. And it shows you which gardens have which particular vines for you to look at. Other gardens in the region that you may want to visit are the U.S. National Arboretum, particularly Fern Valley. Meadowlark Botanical Gardens is a wonderful garden with a woodland path and meadow gardens and more cultivated garden beds. At the moment, the U.S. Botanic Garden is not open for visitors, but that is a wonderful location to visit when it eventually reopens. And the garden pictured in the middle is the little pocket garden behind the Nature Conservancy headquarters that I mentioned. And finally, many of you may have questions as to where to buy native plants. And for that, I refer you to the Plant Nova Natives website. They have listings of native-only sellers. Some of them are right here in the Northern Virginia area, some a little further afield. Some you can deal with remotely and place online orders. And they also will have listings of any regional plant sales. So do we have any final questions, Colleen?
We certainly do, Elaine. Someone has asked twice about controlling or removing trumpet vine runners, or do you have any more detail about how to control it?
Okay, I wonder if this is just to keep it within check or to remove it.
To keep it in, why don't you do both?
Okay, to keep it in check, you want to be looking for any of those suckering extensions that will appear near the base of that vine, and really cut those back. You would want to just have a really regular pruning regimen. And someone actually, I think in a question earlier, suggested deadheading the flowers before they set fruit and seed. So those would be some possible ways to control it. If you decide that that it's just too aggressive for your growing conditions, and you might want to substitute one of the other vines, I guess you could use that same kind of technique that I was describing for the English ivy, just to use a very sharp tool to try to get down and dig up all of the roots.
Okay, that sounds good. Someone else was worried about Virginia creeper choking out other plants. I think you showed a picture of Virginia creeper among ferns, and will it choke out the ferns? And also, can trees tolerate Virginia creeper?
Good. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We talked about that yesterday, but there were a couple of questions about it. And then someone else asked if they have a red bud that has Virginia creeper in it and they want to get rid of it, what's the best way?
Okay. Good questions, one and all. That particular location where I photographed the ground cover, I think was a garden in North Carolina, and the the vine was spreading pretty nicely along the ground, and the ferns were substantial enough that they were able to grow up through it. But I know that that was right on the UNC Charlotte campus, and I'm certain that there are gardeners who are going through there regularly to probably groom the vine and keep it within check. That's a plant that I actually began growing on a fence because I thought it looked attractive, and it has since sent out some runners. And I've decided to allow it to grow as a ground cover. I find that it's pretty easy to pull it up, and I can just either by pulling up and redirecting the growth of those extending stems, or by just cutting, that I can keep it within check. It's the vigorous growth that could make it a great substitute for that problematic English ivy. Now, as far as growing up into trees, I have read different information on this when I was researching for my presentation on invasive plants in general. Several sources indicated that unlike English ivy, that it was not problematic to have it grow up into trees. But then someone who posed a question or made a comment during that presentation indicated that it really seemed to be problematic. So I have actually not allowed it to grow up into my trees. I find that it's not adhering, especially if it hasn't been allowed to really grow in a woody way, the way the English ivy does, where you have very substantial, thick stems with those aerial rootlets adhering to the bark of a tree. I find that it could be easy enough to pull it off very gently. But if you had any concerns about that, I would just do what I described for controlling the ivy on a tree, which is to cut it back, cut the English ivy, cut the Virginia creeper off at the base where it's starting to grow up the tree, and then just redirect any of the growth and not allow it to go back up into the trees.
Yeah, thank you. Good suggestions. Another person said a lot of the vines you mentioned are toxic to humans and pets. Are there any vines that you would recommend that are safe for both humans and pets?
Well, as I mentioned, the trumpet honeysuckle, I find it's just an excellent native vine for so many reasons. Number one, it's less aggressive than some of the other vines. I find it easy to control. It provides such wonderful support to wildlife, the hummingbirds, the pollinators. It serves as a larval host plant. It provides berries and nesting locations for birds. That's one of my favorites. Now, I know if you have children and you're concerned about them possibly touching the plant or wanting to suck on the nectar of a very showy flower, or if you have pets, you wouldn't want to choose those. But the trumpet honeysuckle, I think, is just a good all-around plant. It blooms for a long period of time, and as I mentioned, in this region, it's semi-evergreen, so it's attractive a good part of the year. That's one of my favorites.
Okay, that's great. Do you have any comments you'd like to make about Boston ivy?
I don't particularly have anything to say, but maybe I can comment when I create this other addendum document.
And another questioner said they're having trouble eradicating morning glory and asked about just covering it with a large layer of mulch.
Yeah, you could try, especially if it's pervasive, you could try covering it with mulch and maybe putting down some plastic or something that would allow it to solarize, that you could try to actually kill it that way. If you absolutely had to go to the extreme and control it with an herbicide, I would do it in that very controlled manner, just that I described earlier, just to segregate, the stems of the plant, and then paint the cut ends with an herbicide to try to kill it all the way down to the roots if the covering, the solarizing with plastic and the covering with mulch doesn't get it under control.
Okay, that's good. And I think that covers the questions. Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, very good. Well, I hope that I've given all of you some ideas about some new vines that you might want to consider for your garden. And as I mentioned, this program is being recorded. I will be personally captioning it. And within a fairly short order, you'll be seeing it posted on the MGNV website, should you want to go back and review any portions of it that you'd like to see again. The addendum document that I'll be creating for any questions that I'll comment on it with additional responses, and any that I'll be going back to answer that I haven't answered completely. All of you who have attended will be receiving an email message with that document, and it will also be posted on the website. So until we see each other again, happy gardening.